"Don't look there," said the Apache woman. But the rancher did, and regretted it forever. The sun was high in the sky, casting a golden glare over the wide Arizona desert. The land stretched endlessly in every direction, dotted with sharp rocks, low scrub, and the occasional twisted mesquite tree. John Miller, a middle-aged rancher with leathery skin and calloused hands, guided his old horse along a dusty trail, squinting against the heat. His herd had scattered after last night's storm, and he had spent the morning tracking the few remaining cattle, trying to bring them back together. The desert had always been harsh, but that day it seemed unusually silent, as if it were holding its breath. John was a practical man. He had spent all his life working the land, raising cattle, fixing fences, and surviving whatever nature sent his way. He didn't believe in old tales or warnings from strangers. Superstitions and ghost stories were for people with too much time on their hands. Yet as he rode deeper into the canyon country, a strange feeling crept over him. A mixture of unease and curiosity. Something about this part of the desert felt different, almost alive. It was then that he noticed movement ahead. At first, he thought it might be a coyote or a desert fox. But as he drew closer, he saw the figure of a woman standing at the edge of the trail. She was tall and thin, wearing a long faded dress and a shawl over her shoulders, her dark hair streaked with gray. She moved with a quiet grace that seemed almost unnatural, her presence commanding attention despite her stillness. She was clearly of Apache descent, her features strong and weathered by years in the harsh desert. John slowed his horse as he approached, unsure if he should speak or pass by quietly. The woman's eyes met his, and he felt a sudden chill despite the heat. There was a wisdom in her gaze, but also something more. An urgent warning that seemed to vibrate through the air itself. "Don't look there," she said in a low, calm voice. John frowned, confused. "I beg your pardon?" he asked, his voice rough from the desert dust. "Don't look there!" the woman repeated, her tone steady but with a weight that made him pause. She didn't point, but her eyes seemed to indicate a nearby canyon hidden behind a ridge of rocks. There was a sense of history and power in the way she spoke, as though the words were carrying a message from the land itself. John laughed softly, shaking his head. "I'm just a rancher, ma'am. I've been through a lot of rough country in my time. There's nothing out there that could scare me." He tried to smile, hoping to ease the tension, but the woman did not respond. She simply watched him with a gaze that seemed to pierce through him, assessing his intentions and perhaps his very soul. Despite his initial dismissal, her words lingered in his mind as he guided his horse around the bend and continued along the trail. There was something unusual about the silence in the canyon. The wind, which usually carried the soft rustle of leaves and the distant cries of birds, was still. Even the sound of his horse's hooves on the dry dirt seemed muted. He could feel the weight of the desert pressing in, making him aware of every sound, every movement. John shook his head again, trying to push the thought away. He had work to do, and he could not afford to be distracted by old tales or strange warnings. He had learned long ago that nature did not care for fear or superstition. It only respected skill, patience, and persistence. Yet even as he reminded himself of these truths, he could not deny the growing sense of unease. The canyon seemed darker, even in the harsh sunlight, and shadows seemed to stretch in impossible directions. As he moved deeper into the rugged terrain, he noticed the marks of the recent storm. Small gullies carved into the earth, pools of water reflecting the sky, and rocks shifted from their usual places. He dismounted to check his map and compass, making sure he was on the right path to find his scattered herd. While studying the terrain, he heard a faint sound, a whisper of movement, almost like footsteps on the rocks. He turned, expecting to see one of his cattle, but there was nothing. The desert, he realized, was holding more than just cattle. There was a presence here, subtle but undeniable. His curiosity grew, as did a faint unease he could not shake. He began to recall stories he had heard as a boy, tales told by older ranchers of strange happenings in the canyons, but he quickly dismissed them. Stories were stories, he reminded himself. Logic and experience mattered more than superstition. As he continued on, he caught another glimpse of the Apache woman standing farther along the trail, her shawl flapping slightly in the wind. She did not speak, but the intensity of her stare made him stop. He felt compelled to speak to her, to ask why she had warned him. Yet, as he opened his mouth, she was gone. It was as if she had melted into the desert itself, a ghost of the land warning him from a place beyond ordinary sight. Shaking his head, John climbed onto a rocky outcrop to get a better view. The canyon stretched below him, jagged and steep, with shadows that seemed to move on their own. He noticed patterns in the rocks and the vegetation that felt unnatural, almost deliberate. Despite his practical nature, a shiver ran down his spine. He could not explain it, but the sense of being watched, of something ancient and aware, grew stronger. He finally spurred his horse down the slope, determined to find his cattle and leave the unsettling feelings behind. But the closer he got to the bottom, the more the canyon seemed to change. Rocks that should have been stable shifted underfoot, and the dry brush seemed to whisper with the wind in strange, almost human-like tones. John's heart began to race, a reaction he had not felt in years. The practical, experienced rancher inside him struggled with the rising panic, telling himself it was all in his imagination. Hours passed, and John worked tirelessly, following tracks and calling out to his herd. But the memory of the Apache woman and her warning never left him. Every time he thought he had found a clue or a sign, it felt as if the canyon itself was testing him, leading him towards something he was not meant to see. The sun began its slow descent, painting the canyon in deep reds and purples, shadows stretching longer and darker than ever before. As the day turned toward evening, John finally stopped to rest, his horse kneeling to drink from a small puddle left by the storm. He looked back at the trail he had followed, toward the ridge where he had first seen the woman. The canyon looked entirely different now, almost forbidding, as if it had been waiting for him to enter. The sense of curiosity battled with his instincts. He wanted to explore, to understand what lay hidden beyond the shadows, but a deep, almost instinctual fear whispered to him to turn back. He shook his head again, trying to focus on his immediate task, finding his herd and returning safely to the ranch. Yet, even as he resolved this, he could not deny the feeling that he had stepped into a story much older than himself, a story written in the rocks, the wind, and the silent warnings of those who had walked the desert long before him. That night, John made camp near a small, dry creek bed. The fire he built crackled and threw dancing shadows against the canyon walls. Every sound, the chirping of crickets, the rustle of a lizard in the brush, seemed amplified in the stillness. He thought again of the woman and her warning. "Don't look there!" He could not stop replaying her words, her calm yet urgent tone. Something about the way she had said it suggested knowledge beyond ordinary understanding. Knowledge that had been passed down through generations. As he lay on his bedroll, staring at the stars above the canyon rim, John realized that this journey was no longer just about lost cattle. It was about the land itself, its history, and the invisible rules that governed it. He felt a mixture of curiosity, fear, and respect for the desert that had always seemed so familiar, yet now felt strangely alive and secretive. Sleep came slowly, and even in dreams he saw flashes of the Apache woman's eyes. The canyon's shifting shadows and the sense that something was waiting for him, something he could not yet understand. When he awoke the next morning, John felt changed in a subtle but undeniable way. The canyon had reached into him, planting a seed of caution and curiosity that would guide every step he took from that moment onward. Little did he know, the warning he had dismissed would soon become impossible to ignore. The events that would unfold in the coming hours would challenge everything he believed about the desert, the land, and the wisdom carried by those who had lived with it for generations. And it all began with a single, simple warning: don't look there. John woke before dawn, the cold desert air biting at his skin. The sky was a pale blue, and the first light of morning brushed the jagged rocks with soft golden hues. He felt restless, his mind still turning over the strange events of the day before. The sudden appearance of the Apache woman, her warning, and the unnatural stillness of the canyon. He knew he should focus on finding the rest of his herd, but curiosity gnawed at him like a persistent wind. Something about that place called to him, urging him to go further, despite the unease that settled deep in his chest. After a quick breakfast of jerky and coffee, he packed his gear and mounted his horse. The herd had scattered further than he thought, and some tracks led him toward the very canyon the woman had warned him about. He tried to ignore the memory of her voice. "Don't look there!" But the words echoed in his mind, impossible to silence. As he rode deeper into the canyon, the landscape began to feel more oppressive. The walls of rock rose sharply on either side, casting deep shadows even in the morning light. The wind whispered through the narrow spaces, carrying a sound like voices carried from far away. John shook his head. He had heard the wind make strange noises before. He was not about to let a little imagination scare him, but the feeling of being watched persisted, prickling at the back of his neck like tiny thorns. The desert, which had always seemed open and straightforward, now seemed full of secrets. Every rock formation, every twisted tree seemed to hide something. Small animals darted from one shadow to another, and a faint rustling followed him wherever he went. Even his horse, usually calm and steady, snorted nervously and shifted its weight. John tried to calm both himself and the animal, patting its neck and speaking softly. Despite his growing tension, John could not resist scanning the canyon floor for any sign of his missing cattle. He found tracks of his herd, but they were scattered, as if something had spooked them further into the desert. He followed the trail with care, navigating the uneven rocks and sudden dips in the earth. The further he went, the more he noticed subtle signs that the canyon was unusual. Some rocks seemed oddly smooth, worn in patterns that didn't match natural erosion. Other stones had deep scratches, almost like markings, and the wind seemed to shift strangely through certain narrow passages. Hours passed, and John began to realize that the canyon was playing tricks on him. Distances seemed distorted. Shadows appeared where there should be light, and he felt dizzy at times, as if the very land was trying to confuse him. He paused often to rest and take stock, but each time he looked up, he noticed new patterns, new signs that something was different here. He tried to focus on practical tasks, noting the tracks, marking his path, and thinking logically about how to gather his herd. But logic could not explain the feeling of eyes following him from places he could not see. As he climbed a small ridge to get a better view, he heard a distant sound, soft, rhythmic, almost like chanting carried on the wind. He froze. The sound was faint but unmistakable, echoing from somewhere deep in the canyon. He strained to listen, trying to determine if it was human or just the wind playing tricks on his ears. The more he listened, the more the sound seemed alive, pulsing with an energy that made the hairs on his arms stand on end. John swallowed hard and shook his head. "It's nothing," he muttered to himself. "Just the wind! Just the wind!" Yet even as he spoke, he felt a tug of curiosity he could not resist. He had to know what was making the sound. Something inside him urged him forward, deeper into the canyon, toward the unknown. The trail led him through narrow passages where the canyon walls pressed close on either side. The air grew cooler, and shadows stretched along across the rocky floor. John's horse hesitated, sensing something unusual. The soft snort and stamping of its hooves broke the silence of the canyon, but nothing answered. The chanting he had heard earlier was gone. Now there was only the wind, whispering through the rocks like a living thing. John dismounted and decided to proceed on foot. The uneven ground and scattered rocks made it difficult to move quickly, but he wanted to be careful. Every step felt heavier than the last, as if the canyon itself resisted his presence. He noticed strange patterns in the soil, small depressions and mounds that seemed deliberate, almost like someone or something had been there long before him. The idea was unsettling, but John pressed on, driven by the need to find his cattle and, secretly, by the need to see what lay ahead. Hours turned into afternoon. The sun climbed higher, and the canyon's shadows shifted with it. John found himself standing at the edge of a small plateau, looking down into a narrow chasm below. He could see hints of movement far ahead, perhaps a part of his herd, but the shadows seemed thicker, almost unnatural. He squinted, trying to distinguish rock from animal. That's when he felt it, a sudden drop in temperature, as if a cold hand had brushed across the back of his neck. He turned, expecting to see a change in the wind, but the canyon was still. Only the echo of his own heartbeat seemed to answer him. The sense of being watched became stronger. John's instincts, honed over decades on the land, screamed at him to be cautious. He remembered the Apache woman's warning, her eyes so serious, her voice calm yet insistent. "Don't look there!" He had dismissed it as superstition. Now, standing on the plateau, he wondered if perhaps she had known something he could not understand. The words echoed through him, mingling with the whispers of the canyon. A sudden rustle from below made him jump. He turned quickly and saw a shadow move in a narrow passage between rocks. It was fleeting, too quick to be a person, but too deliberate to be a wild animal. His heart raced. He told himself to stay calm, to focus on the practical task at hand, finding the herd. Yet curiosity gnawed at him, stronger than fear. He wanted to see, to understand what the canyon was hiding. Carefully, he lowered himself down a steep incline, following the shadow at a safe distance. Each step brought him closer to the unknown, and the air seemed to thrum with energy. The canyon walls rose high above him, narrowing the light and filling him with a sense of being enclosed. He began to notice strange markings on the rocks, lines and shapes that did not seem natural, almost like symbols left by someone long ago. He traced a finger over one of them, feeling the rough texture, and wondered about the people who might have lived here before him. The sound of movement came again, faint but deliberate. It was a rustling, almost like footsteps, but slower and more careful. John froze, straining his ears. He realized that the canyon seemed alive, reacting to his presence. Every step he took was mirrored by a shift in the shadows, a change in the wind, a soft whispering that sent shivers down his spine. By late afternoon, John found himself at the edge of a small clearing where the canyon opened slightly. There, he saw a single piece of evidence that made him stop in his tracks, an old, weathered artifact partially buried in the dirt. It looked ancient, made of stone and etched with symbols he could not understand. The sight filled him with awe and fear. He realized that he had stumbled upon something far older than he could imagine, a place untouched for generations. His practical mind urged him to leave, to return to safety before he pushed his luck too far. Yet he could not tear his eyes away. The artifact seemed to pulse with a silent energy, and the canyon around him felt charged with history and memory. He thought again of the Apache woman, her calm voice warning him, "Don't look there!" And for the first time, John felt the weight of her words, not as superstition, but as knowledge rooted in experience and respect. As the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the canyon floor, John realized he had lost track of time. He had wandered far deeper than he intended, driven by curiosity and the need to understand the strange phenomena around him. The herd was still out there somewhere, but now he understood that the canyon held more than cattle tracks and wind. It held stories, secrets, and perhaps a warning meant for those who dared to enter without respect. Finally, he decided to set up a small camp for the night. The canyon was silent except for the occasional rustle of a lizard or the distant cry of a hawk. He built a fire carefully, keeping it small, and sat by it, thinking about the events of the day. Every sound, every shadow felt amplified. He knew that he had crossed a boundary, not a physical one, but a boundary of understanding, where the land and its history demanded recognition. As darkness fell, the canyon transformed. Shadows grew longer, and the faint whispers of wind seemed to carry voices from the past. John could feel eyes on him, unseen but present, as if the canyon itself were watching. He thought of the Apache woman again, wondering what she would think of him, a man who ignored warnings and walked further into the unknown. That night, sleep was uneasy. John dreamed of shadows moving in impossible ways, of voices whispering secrets he could not understand, and of the eyes of the woman who had warned him. When he awoke before dawn, the first light of the new day revealed the canyon once again, seemingly calm yet holding the same sense of mystery and danger. He knew that whatever lay ahead would test him in ways he could not yet imagine. John woke to another pale dawn, the chill of the desert air pressing against his skin. The fire he had built the night before had long burned out, leaving only a circle of blackened stones and the faint scent of smoke. The canyon around him looked calm in the morning light, but the uneasy feeling from the day before lingered. He had moved farther into this land than he ever intended, and now a growing sense of dread twisted in his stomach. Something told him that today the canyon would reveal its secrets, whether he wanted to see them or not. He packed his small camp quickly, urging his horse forward along a narrow, rocky path. The herd was still somewhere in the canyon, but John had begun to realize that finding them might no longer be the main challenge. The land itself seemed alive, shifting and changing in subtle ways. Every rock seemed to have a story, every shadow carried a warning. His instincts, usually reliable after decades on the ranch, felt uncertain here. He could no longer trust that what he saw was all there was, nor could he ignore the whispering wind that seemed to guide him deeper into the canyon. As he followed the trail, he noticed signs that something terrible had happened here long ago. Bones, small, scattered, partially hidden beneath rocks, caught his eye. He stopped, heart pounding, and knelt to inspect them. They were old, weathered by time, but unmistakably human. A shiver ran through him. He thought of the Apache woman and her warning, "Don't look there." The words came back clearer than ever, and he felt the weight of them like a stone in his chest. He pressed on cautiously, navigating jagged rocks and loose soil. The further he descended, the narrower the canyon became. The shadows grew longer, darker, and the light of the morning seemed to struggle against the walls of stone. He could hear the faint, almost imperceptible sound of water trickling somewhere far below, though no stream was visible. The canyon felt hollow, like it held memories of events that had been long buried. Then he saw it. A small opening in the rocks, partially hidden behind a cluster of boulders. Curiosity tugged at him despite the growing fear. He dismounted and approached slowly, every muscle in his body tense. The opening led to a hidden crevice, and as he peered inside, he could see what appeared to be remnants of a long-forgotten settlement. Old tools, fragments of pottery, and makeshift shelters lay scattered among the rocks. But more alarming were the bones, larger than he had seen before, carefully arranged, as if in ritual. John's mind raced. He had expected to find lost cattle, maybe signs of predators, but not this. The canyon was a graveyard not just of animals, but of people. And the careful placement of the bones suggested a story of sorrow and perhaps a warning. His stomach churned, and he felt the chill of fear creeping through him. The wind whistled through the crevice like a voice, and for the first time John understood the gravity of the Apache woman's warning. He stepped further into the crevice, trying to understand what had happened here. The walls were etched with symbols and lines, some faint, some deeply carved. They told a story, though he could not read it. The shapes seemed almost alive, moving in his mind as he traced them with his fingers. Something ancient and powerful had taken place here. Something meant to remain hidden. The air felt thick, as if the past had seeped into the present, making the canyon itself a witness to old grief and anger. Suddenly, a shadow moved across the far wall of the crevice. John spun around, heart hammering, but saw nothing. The canyon seemed to play tricks on him. Every time he turned, the shadows shifted. A faint whisper echoed through the narrow space, almost like voices carried by the wind. He froze, telling himself it was just his imagination. But deep down, he knew that the canyon had its own secrets, and it was showing him only what it wanted him to see. As he moved deeper, he discovered more bones, some partially hidden beneath rocks, others lying openly on the ground. The realization hit him hard. This place had been the scene of a tragedy long before he arrived. People, Apache perhaps, had suffered here, their stories buried in the earth and in the shadows. And somehow the canyon preserved those memories, keeping them alive in ways John could not explain. The shadows grew darker as he descended further, and he felt a tightening in his chest. The canyon seemed to close in on him, the rocks pressing against him from all sides. He tried to focus on breathing slowly, to stay calm. But the feeling of being watched intensified. Every step felt heavier, every sound magnified. The rustle of the wind, the faint scuttling of unseen creatures, and the echo of his own heartbeat became overwhelming. Then he saw something that made him stumble back in shock. At the bottom of the crevice, partially hidden by rocks, lay an object that glinted in the faint sunlight. A small ceremonial dagger, its blade still sharp despite the years. It was unlike anything he had seen before, carved with intricate symbols and inlaid with stone. The dagger seemed to pulse with a strange energy, almost alive. He realized that the canyon was not just a resting place, but a sacred site, a place of rituals and history that demanded respect. John felt a mixture of awe and fear. He knew he should turn back, leave this place immediately, and never return. But a strange curiosity pushed him forward. He wanted to understand the people who had lived here, what had happened to them, and why the canyon seemed so protective of its secrets. He moved closer to the dagger, his hand trembling slightly as he reached toward it. At that moment, the wind picked up, carrying with it a soft whisper that seemed almost like words. "Leave, or face what has been kept." John froze, realizing that the canyon itself might be warning him. He hesitated, torn between curiosity and self-preservation. His instincts told him to leave, but he couldn't resist one last look around the hidden crevice. As he turned, he noticed something he had missed before. Faint footprints in the dust, too small to be his, leading deeper into the canyon. They were old, weathered, and partially covered by the shifting soil, but unmistakable. Someone, or something, had been here, moving carefully among the bones and artifacts. The thought sent a shiver down his spine. The canyon had been alive with the presence of people before him, and now it felt like it was alive again. John took a deep breath and followed the footprints, careful not to disturb the fragile artifacts around him. The canyon walls closed in, the light dimmed, and the air grew cooler. The shadows seemed to stretch unnaturally, creating shapes that played tricks on his eyes. He felt a growing sense of urgency, as if the canyon were urging him to understand something before it was too late. After a short climb, he emerged into a small clearing at the base of a high rock formation. There, he saw something that made him stop completely. A circle of stones surrounded a hollow in the ground, within which lay the skeletons of people arranged in careful patterns. Their positions suggested reverence, as if they had been placed there for a ceremony or as part of a sacred ritual. John felt a lump in his throat, a mix of fear, sorrow, and respect. He realized he was standing on hallowed ground, a place meant to honor those who had come before. As he observed the scene, he noticed faint carvings on the surrounding rocks, figures of animals, stars, and humans intertwined in patterns he could not fully understand. The artistry and care in the carvings suggested that this was more than a grave. It was a testament to a culture and a people who had been here long before anyone else. John felt the weight of history pressing on him, a reminder of the fragility of life and the depth of human experience. The wind whispered again, carrying voices from the past. They were not words he could understand, but the tone was clear. Warning, sorrow, and a plea for respect. John realized that the Apache woman's warning had not been superstition. She had understood the power of this place, the presence of what had been left behind, and the danger of disturbing it without reverence. He had ignored her advice, and now he felt the canyon itself reminding him of its authority. Suddenly, he heard a movement behind him. He spun around, heart racing, but saw nothing. The canyon was silent, except for the wind and the distant cry of a hawk. The shadows shifted, creating shapes that seemed almost human. Fear gripped him, but he forced himself to stay calm. He had come too far to retreat blindly. He needed to understand what he had found, to respect it without causing harm. John spent the remainder of the day carefully exploring the clearing, observing the patterns of the stones and carvings, and documenting everything he could. He did not touch the bones or artifacts, knowing instinctively that some things were sacred and not meant to be disturbed. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the canyon, he felt a mixture of awe and terror. He had uncovered a place that held memories, warnings, and power far beyond his understanding. That night, as he camped near the clearing, John could not sleep. The shadows of the canyon seemed alive, stretching toward him, whispering secrets of the past. The dagger he had seen earlier glinted faintly in the firelight, reminding him of the thin line between curiosity and danger. He realized that the canyon had changed him, revealing truths about history, respect, and the consequences of ignoring warnings. When he finally drifted into uneasy sleep, his dreams were filled with shadows and whispers, the faces of those long gone watching him, teaching him lessons he could not yet fully understand. He knew that the events of the next day would challenge him further, pushing him to confront the full reality of the canyon and the consequences of his curiosity. The morning sun rose slowly, casting long, golden beams across the canyon. John awoke with a tightness in his chest, a lingering unease from the previous day. The shadows in the canyon seemed longer, darker, as if they remembered everything that had happened there and were watching him still. He rubbed his eyes, listening to the faint sounds of the desert waking up. The distant call of a hawk, the whisper of wind through the rocks, and the quiet rustle of small creatures in the underbrush. Yet beneath these ordinary sounds was something else, something he could not name, a presence that made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. John sat by the small fire he had made the night before, sipping coffee from a tin cup, trying to calm his racing mind. He knew he had to be careful. The canyon was no ordinary place. He had discovered the hidden clearing, the bones, the artifacts, and the carvings on the rocks. He had felt the power of the land, the weight of history, pressing down on him. He had seen firsthand that some places were meant to remain undisturbed, but still he had stayed. He could not turn away, not yet. As he packed his gear and prepared to explore a little further, he noticed the wind shifting. It moved in patterns he had never observed before, rustling through narrow passages and carrying with it a faint whisper, almost like voices speaking just out of earshot. He stopped and listened carefully. The words were unintelligible, yet there was no mistaking their tone. A warning, urgent and sorrowful. John shivered, realizing that the canyon was not silent. It was alive in its own way, keeping watch over its history, its secrets, and those who dared to enter. He mounted his horse and moved slowly along the trail that led deeper into the canyon. Every step seemed heavier than the last, every sound amplified. The canyon walls rose sharply on either side, narrowing the path and casting deep shadows that seemed to move in the corner of his vision. He tried to focus on practical thoughts, finding the remaining cattle, returning to safety, but the memories of the previous day kept intruding. The image of the arranged bones, the ceremonial dagger, and the carved rocks stayed vividly in his mind, as if the canyon itself was replaying its history for him. Hours passed, and John felt increasingly uneasy. The sun was high, yet the canyon seemed to grow darker with every step. He began to notice subtle changes, shadows that shifted against the light, rocks that seemed to lean toward him, and a faint vibration in the air, almost like a heartbeat. His instincts, honed over decades of ranching, warned him to turn back, yet his curiosity pushed him forward. He felt compelled to understand what the canyon was trying to show him, even if it frightened him. Then, as he rounded a bend, he saw it, a series of footprints in the dust, fresh but faint, leading toward a narrow crevice. He dismounted and crouched low, studying them carefully. They were not the tracks of an animal. They were human, though smaller than his own. The footprints moved deliberately, carefully, as if whoever or whatever had made them knew the canyon well. John's heart began to race. He had thought he was alone. Now he realized that he might not be. Following the footprints cautiously, he reached the crevice. The air grew colder here, and the shadows seemed to gather, forming shapes that his mind struggled to recognize. He could hear a faint whispering again, like voices carried from the past. His first instinct was to turn back, to leave the canyon and never return, but something held him in place, a mixture of curiosity, fear, and awe. He stepped forward slowly, his eyes scanning every inch of the rocks, the soil, and the shadows. As he moved deeper, he felt a pressure in the air, as if the canyon itself was aware of his presence. The carvings on the rocks seemed more vivid than before, their lines almost moving as he looked at them. He saw patterns of animals, stars, and humans intertwined, telling stories he could not fully understand. And yet, there was a sense of purpose, a message, embedded in the shapes, a silent plea for respect and understanding. John realized that the canyon was not only alive with memory, but also with intention. It wanted him to see, but only in the way it allowed. By mid-afternoon, he reached the clearing once more. The circle of stone surrounded the hollow in the ground, and the arrangement of skeletons still lay undisturbed. He approached carefully, not touching anything, and felt a deep sadness settle over him. The canyon was a place of mourning, a place where those who had come before had been remembered and honored, and now he understood that his presence, though respectful, was also an intrusion. He was a stranger in a sacred place, and the canyon would remind him of that in its own way. Suddenly, he heard movement behind him. He turned sharply, heart pounding, but saw nothing. The shadows shifted again, and for a moment he thought he glimpsed the figure of the Apache woman from days ago, standing at the edge of the clearing, watching him silently. He blinked, and she was gone. The wind picked up, carrying with it a soft whisper. Respect what is hidden. John swallowed hard, realizing that the canyon's warnings were real. He had ignored the first warning, but now he could feel the consequences of curiosity unchecked. As he sat quietly trying to make sense of what he had seen, he felt a sudden chill. The air seemed to thrum around him as if the canyon itself were alive with memory and emotion. Shadows stretched toward him, forming shapes that were almost human. He could feel eyes upon him, unseen yet present, watching, judging, and teaching. It was overwhelming, but he knew he had to remain calm. To panic would be to disrespect the place further, and he had already crossed the line once. Hours passed in a tense stillness. John felt the weight of the canyon pressing down on him, a heavy mixture of history, sorrow, and warning. The whispers continued, sometimes faint, sometimes almost like words he could almost understand. He thought again of the Apache woman and her voice, calm but insistent. "Don't look there!" He understood now that her warning had not been empty superstition. She had known the power of this land, the presence of its history, and the consequences of curiosity without respect. As evening approached, John decided to leave the clearing and find a safer place to camp. He moved slowly, careful not to disturb the rocks or the artifacts. The shadows grew longer, merging with the approaching darkness, and the whispers seemed to follow him along the trail. He could feel the presence of the past pressing against him, guiding his steps while testing his resolve. Each movement felt like a negotiation with the canyon itself, a reminder that he was a guest in a place older and more powerful than he could comprehend. When he finally found a small plateau suitable for setting up camp, he built a fire and sat beside it, trying to process everything he had experienced. He realized that the canyon had changed him, revealing a world beyond ordinary perception, a world where history, memory, and respect were tangible forces. He thought about the artifacts, the bones, and the carvings, and understood that his role here was to observe, learn, and respect. The canyon had allowed him to see, but only because he had approached with care, curiosity, and caution. Night fell, and the canyon transformed. The shadows deepened, and the wind carried whispers that seemed closer, more urgent. John felt a mixture of fear and awe as he sat by the fire. Every sound, the crackling of the flames, the rustle of the wind, the distant cry of an animal, felt amplified. The canyon had a presence that was impossible to ignore, a silent force that reminded him of his own smallness and vulnerability. Sleep came slowly, and when it did, it was filled with visions of the past. He saw the people who had once lived in the canyon, their daily lives, their struggles, and the ceremonies they performed. He saw moments of joy and sorrow and the careful way they honored their dead and their history. The shadows of the night seemed to replay these memories, teaching him lessons about respect, humility, and the consequences of ignoring warnings. When he awoke before dawn, the canyon was bathed in soft light, yet the presence he had felt the day before remained. He realized that he could never forget what he had seen, nor the lessons the canyon had imparted. He understood that some places were meant to remain mysterious, that some warnings were sacred, and that curiosity without respect could lead to consequences far greater than one could imagine. John took one last look at the clearing before beginning his descent back toward the wider trail. The artifacts, the bones, the carvings, all remained in place, untouched by his hands. He felt a deep respect for the land and its history, and a renewed understanding of the Apache woman's warning. The canyon had not allowed him to harm it, but it had left a lasting impression on his mind and soul. As he rode back through the narrowing canyon, John understood that the experiences of these days would stay with him forever. The whispers, the shadows, the presence of the past, they were no longer external, but had become a part of him. He would carry the lessons of the canyon into every choice he made, sharing the story carefully with those who would listen, always remembering the words of the woman who had first warned him, "Don't look there." The canyon had taught him that curiosity was a powerful force, but one that must be tempered with respect, humility, and awareness. And as he finally emerged into the open desert, the wide expanse of sunlight and sky offered relief, but also a quiet reminder. Some truths are not meant to be uncovered, and some places hold secrets that are better left undisturbed. The desert morning was calm, the horizon bathed in soft pink and golden light. John Miller had spent the night in a small camp outside the main canyon clearing, and for the first time in days he felt a small sense of calm. The wind whispered gently through the rocks, carrying with it the faint scent of sage and earth, and for a moment he thought he could hear the faint echoes of the canyon's secrets fading into the distance. But deep down he knew that what he had seen and experienced would never truly leave him. He carefully packed his gear, leaving nothing behind that could disturb the fragile balance of the canyon. Every artifact, every stone, and every trace of the ancient rituals had been left untouched. John had learned that some things were not meant to be taken or disturbed, that history itself demanded respect. As he mounted his horse, he cast a final glance at the canyon, its jagged rocks glowing in the soft light of dawn. The shadows of the previous days lingered in his memory, a reminder of what had been revealed to him, and the warnings he had ignored. The journey back to the main trail was quiet, almost eerily so. The desert seemed peaceful, yet John remained alert. The canyon had shown him glimpses of something far greater than himself, something beyond understanding, a place alive with memory, warning, and history. He felt both humbled and awed by what he had witnessed. The whispering wind, the shadows, and the silent presence of the past had all left their mark on him. As he traveled, John thought about the Apache woman who had warned him days before. Her voice, calm and insistent, had seemed strange at the time, almost like an echo of the land itself. But now he understood her wisdom. She had known the canyon's secrets, its power, and the dangers of venturing too far without respect. Her warning, simple as it was, "Don't look there," had carried the weight of generations of knowledge and experience. He realized that he had ignored it. Yet the canyon had not punished him. Instead, it had taught him, leaving a lasting impression that would guide him for the rest of his life. John's mind wandered back to the people whose bones and artifacts he had seen. They had lived, loved, and passed on, leaving traces of their existence in the rocks, carvings, and ceremonial spaces of the canyon. He felt a profound connection to them, even though centuries separated their lives from his own. The stories embedded in the land spoke to him in a language he could not fully understand, but their message was clear. The past deserved reverence, and curiosity must be tempered with respect. As he approached the area where he had first encountered the Apache woman, John's thoughts grew reflective. He had entered the canyon with the intention of finding lost cattle, yet he had discovered something far more significant. The journey had transformed him, teaching him lessons that no amount of experience on the ranch could have conveyed. The land had become a teacher, the shadows a guide, and the whispers a cautionary voice reminding him of the delicate balance between curiosity and respect. The herd was eventually found scattered near a dry creek, unharmed but skittish. John worked carefully, gathering the cattle with gentle words and patient guidance. As he led them back to the open plains, he could not shake the memories of the canyon. Every step on the familiar desert ground felt different now, imbued with a sense of reverence and humility. The experience had left him more aware of the land, its hidden stories, and the invisible rules that governed it. On the ride back to his ranch, John reflected on the deeper lessons of the canyon. Life, he realized, was full of places and moments that demanded attention, care, and respect. The world was larger and more mysterious than he had ever imagined. Some truths, hidden in the folds of history and memory, were meant to remain undisturbed. Others, like the whispering wind and the shadows, were meant to guide those willing to listen. He understood now that knowledge was not simply about discovery, but about wisdom. The wisdom to know when to look and when to turn away. Back at the ranch, John took a long moment to survey his land. The fences, the pastures, and the wide open plains were familiar and comforting, yet he could no longer see them as he once had. Everything was layered with the memory of the canyon, the echoes of the past, the weight of history, and the lessons of respect and humility. He shared some of his story with a few trusted neighbors, carefully leaving out the details that could provoke fear or misunderstanding. His goal was not to terrify, but to teach that some places held lessons far beyond ordinary understanding, and that listening to the wisdom of others was sometimes as important as seeing for oneself. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in brilliant hues of orange and pink, John sat on the porch of his small ranch house. He thought about the Apache woman once more, her eyes filled with knowledge and caution. He understood now that she was a guardian of the land in her own way, a bridge between the past and the present. Her simple words, "Don't look there!" had carried the weight of centuries, guiding him away from disrespect and potential harm. He felt gratitude not only for her warning but for the lesson she had imparted indirectly through the canyon. Over the following weeks, John's routine returned to normal. He repaired fences, tended to his cattle, and managed the land as he always had. Yet he noticed a subtle change in himself. He moved with more care, observing the patterns of the land, the tracks of animals, and the whisper of the wind with new awareness. He had come to understand that the desert, the rocks, and even the shadows held meaning if one was willing to see and listen. Life on the ranch became more than work. It became a partnership with the land, grounded in respect and humility. John never returned to the canyon. The memory of its shadows, its whispers, and the sacred clearing remained vivid, a reminder that some places were not meant for constant exploration. He passed by its ridge only once more from a distance and felt the same mixture of awe and caution that had gripped him when he first entered. He understood that the land had its own rules, and that those who did not heed them might never fully comprehend the lessons embedded in the stones and wind. Over time, John's story spread quietly among those who valued the desert and its history. It was not a tale of fear or ghostly encounters, but of respect, learning, and awareness. Neighbors and visitors learned to listen to the land, to respect the places that carried the weight of history, and to honor the wisdom of those who had walked before them. John became known not only as a rancher, but as someone who understood the deeper truths of the desert, a man who had learned from the land in a way that few others had. Years later, John would often think back to the canyon and the Apache woman who had warned him. He never forgot her words, nor the lessons they contained. He understood that curiosity, while natural and valuable, carried responsibility. To see was not always to know, and to understand was not always to act. He carried the memory of the canyon as both a gift and a warning, a guide for the rest of his life. Even in his older years, when he walked the open plains of his ranch and watched the sun set behind distant hills, he would pause to feel the wind on his face, listening for whispers and echoes. The desert had taught him patience, awareness, and respect. It had shown him that some truths were hidden not out of malice but out of reverence, and that the wisdom of those who had come before was a treasure worth honoring. In the end, John understood that the canyon had given him more than just a lesson. It had changed him forever. He had entered as a man seeking lost cattle, curious and skeptical, but he emerged as someone who had glimpsed the past, understood the sacredness of certain places, and learned the delicate balance between curiosity and respect. The memory of the canyon, its shadows and its whispers would stay with him always, guiding him, teaching him, and reminding him that some warnings, no matter how simple, carry the weight of generations. And as he looked out across the wide plains, the wind carrying the scent of earth and sage, he finally understood the full meaning of the woman's words. Don't look there. Some things were better seen only with respect, some places held lessons meant to shape the heart and mind. And some truths were eternal, waiting patiently for those willing to learn them without disturbing their power. John Miller had learned that lesson, and he would never forget it.